All right, now that we have the FreeMarker foundation for our theme, let's go ahead and turn our attention towards some of this styling. Now, like I mentioned before, our main sort of source file for our customizations when it comes to CSS is going to be the _custom.scss file. All right, this is where all of our customizations should go, and it's ultimately going to be read in another file when the theme is deployed. Now, if you look in the CSS folder in build, you'll see that there are a large group of CSS files that we can actually modify. And these are going to more or less represent the clay base that I was mentioning before. These are components that are built on Bootstrap that will include some of that styling, and we can actually go ahead and modify these as needed as well, which we will do in our theme. Now, like I mentioned before, clay is actually built on Bootstrap 4, and we've also converted less in default Bootstrap to Sass. Now, we've done that for a number of reasons, as we can see here. Sass is going to benefit us by giving us a number of features in our actual CSS, and it's going to allow us to be more modular and more efficient with our actual code. So with Sass, we can do things like create variables in our CSS. We can add mixins, all right, either creating our own or taking advantage of some mixin libraries. We have things like extending and inheritance that allow us to do things like share properties between selectors. We have nesting that's going to allow us to cut back some code and give us the same visual hierarchy as our HTML. And we have things like operators that will give us the ability to do things like math operations in our CSS. So let's take a look at some of the Sass features that will give us a more efficient approach to our styling. For starters, one of the reasons that you see all of those underscore files is because these are what are called Sass Partials. Now, partials are not going to be read on deploy, okay? They are snippets of CSS code that are distinct and need to actually be imported into a main SCSS file for them to be read. All right. Now, the purpose of this is to give us the ability to be more modular so we can actually see the components that we're styling, but also it's going to improve the deploy process for our CSS. Now, partials are going to be imported using the @import directive, and the main file that's going to ultimately read everything is going to be our main.scss file. This is what's actually going to be read by our theme on deploy, and you'll see here it's actually going to include custom at the very bottom. So that's how we know that everything that goes into our _custom.scss is going to indeed have the final say. That's why we have that as our main CSS source file when it comes to customizations. All right, we also have things like variables that we can take advantage of. For example, if we wanted to look in the clay custom partial, there are a number of default variables that can be set here. You'll see some of these here that we can actually modify. All right. The main benefit of doing something like this is we can provide a number of variables for things like our color scheme, and then we can go ahead and just use those variables throughout our CSS without having to worry about where each individual color is across all of our partials. By centralizing it here with our variables, we can just go ahead and update the variables if we need to update the color scheme, and we should be good to go. All right, we also have mixins. Like I said, mixins can be custom, or we can go ahead and use a mixin framework. Mixins allow us to simplify or streamline the process of writing more complex CSS code. So for example, if we wanted to write a mixin for border radius, okay, we can write the mixin to read all of these specific browser CSS prefixes we would need to use. And then once the mixin is created, we can just simply run @include with our mixin with the actual radius in there, and then we're good to go. Dramatically simplifies the process of getting all of our browsers compatible, specifically with things like CSS3 code. Now, in order to avoid forcing you as the developers to recreate some of those common CSS3 mixins, we've included a mixin library called Bourbon. We're using version 4 of Bourbon. And what this does is, again, gives us that greater flexibility with some CSS3 with less lines of code. So for example, right here we have a font face mixin. Okay, you can see on top with the @include. Here we simply include the name of the font as well as the path to where the files are. And what this is going to do for us is it's going to generate all of the CSS required to actually read those fonts. And we could actually do this in our theme as well if we wanted to. Next, we have things, like I said, inheritance, nesting, operators. These basically give us a lot more flexibility with things like taking some specific styles from one selector to another without having to rewrite the entire thing, so it makes things more efficient. Nesting, again, allows us to reflect the HTML structure that we have, and it also makes our code more efficient as well. And then again, developers can use things like operators to do math in CSS as well. So here's an example of inheritance in the Liferay custom.scss file. Again, you can find this in your build folder. All right. What this is doing is it's just simply extending the code for alert danger, alert warning, and alert success. So instead of rewriting that code, we recognize that we want the exact same CSS elements, and we can just simply pull them in using inheritance. Okay. So again, this could be anywhere from 15 to 20 lines of code that we've now cut down to 3 in terms of that add extend. All right, now in the classic theme, that is that theme that shows up in Liferay when you start up for the first time, we have an example of nesting in the custom.scss, where we just simply have the header, and then we have some classes that are nested under there, okay, including the anchor tag as well, with their CSS styling. Again, what this does is it helps us to reflect our actual HTML structure, or free marker structure as the case may be. And it also allows us to cut back code and make it more efficient. Okay. Now it's worth noting here, when you do nesting, make sure that everything is closed properly, because if not, you will get errors when trying to deploy. It is very sensitive. All right, so just keep that in mind. And again, with operators here, we have the ability to do math in our CSS. So for example, if a developer wanted to calculate the widths of a class that outputs as a percentage, they could do something like this with the width. So 600 pixels over 960 pixels times 100%, and then it's going to output a simple fluid grid based off that 960 pixels and would actually generate the percentage for us. So with all of that in mind, we can actually go ahead and do quite a bit in our CSS. Now, of course, to add custom CSS to our theme, we need to do just like we did with the templates folder. We need to take whatever files we want to modify from the build CSS folder, and we need to put them into source. So that's exactly what we are going to do. We are going to take our CSS and we're going to place it in our source CSS folder, and then we're going to go ahead and modify it from there. Now to recap here before we actually dive in with our theme, remember that our CSS is going to be where we apply our global styling to the platform. And what we're doing here is we're taking advantage of Sass. We're taking advantage of those partials that represent our clay components, as well as things like Bourbon to give us some of those CSS3 mixins that we can work with. So we have the ability to use variables, operators, nesting, inheritance, and mixins as well. Okay, and those partials allow us to be much more modular. We can go ahead and work with our custom SCSS file for our custom styling and know that ultimately everything is going to be read in that main.scss file as well. So we've talked a lot. Let's go ahead and take a look at what this actually looks like in practice with our theme. All right, so let's go ahead and get started.